Hello. So, autism spectrum disorder, as we all know, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. But that is not just one neurodevelopmental disorder that we know of. There are some things that you all might have heard in the context of autism. Something like ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Then something like LD, that is learning disability or learning disorders, and maybe something like intellectual disability. Yes, all these three conditions that I named just now are also neurodevelopmental disorders. That is, the deficits that the children face because the way their brain is developing is little different and is little problematic. Autism spectrum disorder will show a lot of symptoms overlapping with these other three disorders. That's why there is a lot of confusion that whether my child is having ADHD or is it autism. Why? Because attention deficit or inability to be attentive, inability to concentrate can be seen in autism spectrum as well as in something what we call it as ADHD. But firstly, let me clarify that each one of this, the autism spectrum, the ADHD, LD, and intellectual disability, previously known as mental retardation, all these are in themselves distinct disorders with distinct symptoms of each. Okay. Yes, there is an overlap seen, but your child is usually going to have one prominent disorder and there could be some subtle symptoms from the other disorder, but that does not mean that child has the other disorder too. There are a lot of permutations and combinations that can happen because a child on autism may have ADHD, a child who is on autism may have LD. Okay, so there is going to be either both the conditions existing in a child, or your child will have one condition prominently with some symptoms which look like attention deficit or hyperactivity. So this is one. The second, let me tell you what are these conditions on its own. So autism spectrum, as we know, there are two fundamental things where the child will have problems. One is the social communication and social interaction, where the child will have problems in language and speaking, in understanding relationships and maintaining eye-to-eye contact. And the other domain of autism is where the child will have some stereotypical repetitive behaviors and sensitivity problems. These are the core symptoms of autism. When it comes to ADHD, these children will have core symptoms where they have either problems in maintaining attention and or they have problems with the impulse control and they are hyperactive. Okay, so you will have child who will be more of would not have ability to concentrate, will make spelling mistakes, will make silly mistakes, will forget things. And with that, you will see some symptoms where the child is impulsive, blurts out answers, doesn't know to wait for his turn. He is continuously doing activities. He's as if driven by a motor. This is how an ADHD child will look like. Okay. On the other hand, when you have learning disability or learning disorder, in that you have difficulties only and only related to academics, where the child will have problem in reading, that is dyslexia, writing, that is called as dysgraphia, and mathematical operations, that is called as dyscalculia. These children will not have problems when it comes to social interaction, communication. These children will not show any sort of repetitive behaviors, what you see in autism. Okay, LD or learning disabilities are completely concerned with major problems in the three areas of reading, writing, and mathematics, right? And lastly, the intellectual disability, which was previously called as mental retardation. Here, the child will have global dysfunction or global deficit in terms of the way he is functioning intellectually, that is in his academics, in his social life, as well as in general, reasoning, logic, abstraction, all these areas are into problems. So there is a global deficit that the child will have. As a layperson, it is not easy for anybody to differentiate whether the child has LD or intellectual disability or autism many times, because symptoms can overlap. That is why whenever your child shows any of the deficits in terms of delayed milestones or something which is not appearing to be normal, or something which you see in normal children but in your child you're not able to see that, then do not always stick to the Google and try to diagnose your child yourself, because these are the conditions who have very subtle differences, and they can be diagnosed only by a professional after proper assessments. Okay, so fundamentally each of them is a different condition, but yes, there could be overlap of symptoms. So get your child diagnosed properly from a professional. That is one part. There are two more things which get confused when it comes to autism per se. Many times it happens that a shy child is thought to be autistic, or sometimes an autistic child is thought to be shy. Okay, now there is a big difference. How do you differentiate that whether a child is not mixing with people because of autism and because of a deficit that is there in the way social interaction works? The child is not aware of that. Is it because of that deficit, or the child is just shy? The difference is that a shy child initially will not make eye-to-eye contact with strangers, will be closed when you go to a new circumstance or to a new situation. But after you spend some time, or after the child spends some time with a stranger or in that new situation, the child will eventually loosen up, he will warm up, and he will slowly start interacting, from sidelines maybe. But he will slowly start looking, he will slowly start seeing that stranger, that what he's doing, how he's doing things. He will slowly start being a part of the new situation too. This, however, does not happen when the child is autistic. That is how you differentiate. No matter how much ever amount of time the child spends in new situation, or how much ever amount of time the child will spend with a stranger, that is not going to help the child in being able to be open and communicative. That is an indicator that this behavior is not out of shyness, but because of autism. That is one thing. The second thing, what is commonly confused, is when a child is obstinate, rather uh, whether a child is throwing a temper tantrum or it is a meltdown. So whenever you see a child who is extremely cranky, who is rolling on the floor, who is crying and screaming, we quickly jump to the conclusion that the child is having a temper tantrum. But autistic child will also do same thing, but we don't call it as a temper tantrum. We call it as a meltdown. It's a different separate term with a separate meaning. How do you differentiate that? A temper tantrum is usually coming out of some need of the child, or where a child wants to achieve a particular goal by throwing that tantrum. For example, if a child is not given his favorite biscuit, the child will roll down, he will cry, he will scream, he will try to bang his head on the floor. But then the temper tantrum will stop either when the biscuit is given to the child, or the adult who is around becomes extremely strict, or the adult who is around just ignores it. The tantrum will go away on itself if one of these three things happen. But when it is an autistic meltdown, the meltdown, which is also in form of screaming, crying, or many times head banging, does not go away by any of these things, right? Because first, it is not done purposely to achieve some goal by the child. And secondly, it is coming out of the overwhelming state that the child is going through. So either it is a sensory overwhelming, or it is some emotional overwhelming. So when there is an overwhelming state, there is an internal chaos, and that chaos is coming out in form of these kind of behaviors which look like temper tantrums, but they are not. Another important aspect of autistic meltdown, which is different from temper tantrum, is that temper tantrum happens mostly when there is an audience, because the child wants to get something out of that audience. Okay, and whatever adults who are there. But an autistic meltdown doesn't need an audience. It can happen with or without audience. The child will have meltdown even when the child is alone. That's the fundamental difference between a meltdown and a temper tantrum. Why we need to know this is because if you resort to the same methods, the way of treating temper tantrums for an autistic child, it is going to be a problem. We know that temper tantrums need to be treated by ignoring or by being very strict and firm, or at times some parents also resort to physically punish the child, right? For a temper tantrum, it may work, or it works rather. But for an autistic child, if you use same methods, considering that it's a temper tantrum, it is going to be problematic. It will increase the problem because remember, it is not coming out of child wanting to get something out of you. It is just the inner chaos that is being reflected. So punishment or shouting or ignoring even this particular behavior of an autistic child will only aggravate the problem. So as a parent, we need to figure out, understand that what is a meltdown, and figure out along with your professional the strategies to handle meltdowns correctly in your child. Okay, so whether you have to resort to some self-soothing strategies, or you need to teach the child some self-soothing strategies, or you can use some sensory soothing strategies, all that you need to figure out. That is the way you handle it. And that's why we need to know the difference and important difference of this, so that we are clear about how to handle our children properly, specifically the autistic children.